Hi, I'm Bailey,
And I'm Amy.
and welcome to Dive in 5 for 5th grade rounding, and today we're going to talk about some place value strategies. For your first task before we dive into our work today, I want you to pause the video and I want you to complete these 4 tasks on your own or with a team or partner. After you've finished solving them, go ahead and order them in a learning progression and start thinking about what do students need to know for each of these tasks in order to be successful. So as we think about rounding with a progression with the new best benchmarks, we can think about third grade. Third graders are expected to compose and decompose those 4-digit numbers in multiple different ways. They're also expected to plot, order, and compare numbers up to 10,000, and then they start working with rounding with numbers from 0 to 1,000 to the nearest 10 or 100.
When we get into fourth grade, they're now rounding whole numbers from 0 to 10,000 to the nearest 10, 100, or 1,000. And they're also using rounding to estimate solutions to problem using any of the 4 operations.
Right, and so then we continue to build on that knowledge in 5th grade, and we talk about rounding multi-digit numbers with decimals to the thousands place, and we round them to the nearest hundredth, tenth, or whole number. And this is going to be where most of our focus is today for our Dive in 5 video.
For our students to be successful in 5th grade, we want them to focus on those place value strategies, and they can start using those concrete models and tools such as place value discs and base 10 blocks.
Right, and once students know how to represent numbers using place value, they'll then be able to use these open number lines to help them round those whole number multi-digit numbers to the decimal, to the nearest tenth, and the hundredth place. As students are continuing to deepen their understanding of place value and rounding multi-digit numbers in 5th grade, they're going to begin to develop an algorithm that they can use when they're rounding. So the first step with understanding place value is that students have to be able to represent the number, including the decimal, and they need to be able to do that with concrete tools and representations.
So here you can see a place value mat. So students can take either their base 10 blocks or their place value disc and represent that on the place value mat. You can see the models being drawn onto the mat and then the numbers being represented under it as well.
Right, and using that place value mat in conjunction with the concrete tools really helps them develop that deep understanding that they need in order to be able to round numbers.
So once students understand how to represent those multi-digit numbers with decimals, they can then use a number line or an open number line to represent that number. So they want to be able to represent each of the endpoints and also the midpoint for rounding a number to the nearest tenth and hundredths place. Looking back at your task from the beginning, task 4 will walk you through using an open number line.
Absolutely. So using this open number line, students have to determine the endpoints and the midpoints, and they're going to need supports with this. So if we look at this task and we consider the numbers 78 and 246 thousandths to the nearest hundred, the two endpoints are going to be 78 and 24 hundredths and 78 and 25 hundredths because we're rounding to the hundredths place. Then when I consider what my midpoint is going to be 78 and 246 thousandths. After I have my endpoint and my midpoint figured out, I can then plot my number and determine where it comes closest to. That is why it's so critical that students understand how to represent multi-digit numbers using place value strategies.
So when students are rounding numbers, they need to explain their understanding, and we want them to do this using good place value language. So if you refer back to task 2 and task 3 from the beginning, what misconceptions might students have about task 3 in comparison to task 2?
So if we look at both of them, they're both asking students to round them to a certain decimal place. However, if you look at task number 4, it's asking you to round to the nearest hundredth, and when I round to the nearest hundredth, only one of my digits is really affected. If you look at task number 3, multiple digits are going to be affected when I round to the nearest tenth. In order for students to understand this, they have to understand that bundling process, that when I have 10 of a certain unit, I go to the next place value. And so this is really critical in tasks like number 3, where students have to understand what happens to multiple digits while rounding a number. Once students are able to round multi-digit numbers to the nearest tenth or hundredth place, they can then start to generate numbers that follow a specific rounding rule. So for example, task number 1 asked you to generate 3 numbers that rounded to 29 and 3/10 when they rounded to the 10th place.
So for students to be successful with this task, they need to understand what happens to the value of the digits when a number is rounded to a specific place. And here you can see 3 examples that when rounded to the nearest 10th place, they will round to 29 and 3/10. When thinking about the CRA model for the concrete, students can use those place value discs and those base 10 blocks to model their decimals when rounding. For the representational, they can draw out their place value discs on that place value mat and also using that open number line to round.
Right, and when we're thinking about the CRA method, we really want to make sure that we're going back and forth between these different islands and ways of thinking to make sure that students are building those strong bridges. So when they're representing those numbers with those concrete tools, they should then be able to connect it to the representation or the drawing and also the number line. As students progress through their thinking, they'll begin to start being able to round using this abstract thinking. So if you take a minute and pause your video, you can read what this guy is thinking. But basically, he's thinking about a number, he's able to determine what is closest to, and therefore can round it quickly in his head. Thanks so much for joining us for our Rounding 5th Grade Math Dive in 5 video. We hope that you got a lot out of it.
And we'll see you next time.